The year is 922. On the banks of the Volga River, the air is thick with smoke, fear, and whispers of gods. An Arab traveler, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, watches with horrified eyes as a Viking funeral unfolds before him. Before the day is done, a young woman will be strangled, stabbed, and burned alive beside her master. Her body will join his in flames so hot that the ship itself collapses into ash. This is not the peaceful image of Vikings that sagas sometimes try to paint. This is not the calm burial in a green meadow. This is something raw, something brutal, something terrifying. For the Vikings, death was not a quiet farewell, it was a performance of fire, sacrifice, and spectacle. To them, a funeral was as much for the living as it was for the dead. It reminded everyone of the gods' power, the thin line between life and death, and the price of entering Valhalla. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on the horrifying reality of Viking funerals. And once you see the truth, you'll never look at the Vikings the same way again. Part 1. Death in the Viking World. To understand Viking funerals, you first need to understand how the Norse saw death. Death to a Viking was not an ending. It was a doorway, a passage into another world, but which world you entered depended entirely on how you lived, and more importantly, how you died. If you died bravely, weapon in hand, you could be chosen by the Valkyries and taken to Valhalla, the great hall of Odin. Here, warriors would feast endlessly, drink rivers of mead, and fight glorious battles every single day. Then, when Ragnarok, the end of the world, finally came, these chosen dead would rise again and fight alongside the gods. If you were not chosen for Valhalla, there was another chance. The goddess Freya claimed half of the fallen warriors for her own hall, Folkvangr, where life was gentler but still honorable. But for those who died in shame, cowards, criminals, or those who avoided the call of battle, there was hell. This was not the burning Christian hell, but a cold, gray, joyless place. To the Viking mind, this was a fate worse than death itself. Because of these beliefs, funerals mattered. They weren't simply about disposing of a body. They were about guiding the soul into the next world, proving to the gods that the person deserved honor, and reminding everyone who remained alive that their own fate still hung in the balance. A Viking funeral wasn't just a family matter, it was a community event. And the bigger and more dramatic it was, the more respect it commanded. A powerful chieftain might be sent off with treasures, animals, and even human lives. A poor farmer might only be buried with a few tools or a simple fire. But one thing was constant: the funeral was never quiet. It was always charged with meaning, fear, and raw spectacle. Part 2. The Ritual of the Dead. When a Viking died, the body was not rushed to the grave. Instead, it was carefully prepared, in ways that were both tender and terrifying. The first step was laying out the body. The dead person was placed in a tent or hall, sometimes for days, while preparations were made. Friends and family came to see the body, offer farewells, and whisper prayers. Next came ritual washing. The body was stripped, cleaned, and anointed with scented oils if the family could afford them. This was not just hygiene, it was spiritual cleansing. The Vikings believed that the dead needed to be purified before meeting the gods. Then, the body was dressed in its finest clothing. A warrior would be clad in armor, a fine tunic, or even a cloak decorated with furs. A woman might be dressed in elaborate dresses, brooches, and beads. The point was clear: the dead should go to the afterlife not in rags, but in honor. But here's where things took a darker turn. The Vikings didn't just bury bodies alone, they buried them with companions. This might include dogs, horses, oxen, or even falcons, all killed to serve the master in the afterlife. Archaeologists have found graves with the bones of animals carefully arranged beside their owners, proof that these killings were deliberate. In the most terrifying cases, the dead were also buried with human sacrifices. A slave or concubine might be chosen to follow their master into death. To the Vikings, this was not murder, it was loyalty. They believed the sacrifice companion would continue serving the dead in Valhalla or wherever their spirit traveled. The body itself was often placed in a ship, or if no ship was available, in a symbolic boat-shaped arrangement of stones. Ships were central to Viking identity, and sending someone off in one was the ultimate sign of respect. Weapons, jewelry, food, and drink were added to the grave or the ship. These were not tokens, they were tools for the afterlife. A warrior might need his sword, a woman might need her keys or spindle, and everyone would need food to sustain them on the long journey into death. For days, the community gathered, feasted, and prepared. Songs were sung, stories were told, and sacrifices were made. The entire settlement would feel the weight of the coming ritual. But then came the part that outsiders found most shocking: the sacrifice of the living. And that's where we'll go in the next part, into the blood-soaked, chilling rituals that made Viking funerals truly terrifying. Part 3. The Sacrifice of the Living. Imagine this: a man of high status has died, perhaps a warrior, a traitor, or even a chieftain. His body lies waiting in a tent, washed, dressed, and ready for the funeral pyre. Outside, the community gathers. They bring gifts, animals for slaughter, and offerings to the gods. But there is one other presence there that makes everyone whisper in fear: a slave girl. She is dressed in fine clothes, her wrists weighed down with jewelry. At first glance, it might seem like she's being honored, but everyone knows what her fate will be. She has been chosen to follow her master into death. This chilling scene was described in painstaking detail by the Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a Viking funeral among the Russes people along the Volga River in the 10th century. His account is the most graphic window we have into what really happened when human sacrifice was performed. The volunteer, or the chosen one. According to Ibn Fadlan, when a great man died, his household would ask his slaves, "Who among you will die with him?" Most would remain silent, eyes lowered, terrified to speak. But sometimes one would step forward. Perhaps she truly believed that to follow her master into the afterlife was an honor. Perhaps she had no choice at all. Either way, once she volunteered, there was no turning back. She was immediately elevated above the others. She was given special treatment, new clothes, jewelry, and endless cups of strong drink. The community wanted her intoxicated, numb to what awaited her. But even as she was celebrated, her fate was sealed. The days of ritual. For days leading up to the funeral, the chosen girl was treated like a bride preparing for her wedding. She moved from tent to tent, drinking with the men of the household. Ibn Fadlan records that she had sexual relations with several of them, as if binding herself to all who had served her master. This was not intimacy, it was ritual, a way to transfer loyalty, life force, and bonds of servitude into the afterlife. Meanwhile, the funeral ship was prepared. The dead man's body was laid inside, resting on cushions, surrounded by his weapons, his tools, and offerings of food and drink. Animals were slaughtered: horses, cows, even dogs, and their blood was splashed on the wood of the ship. Their carcasses were placed inside, as if ready to join their master on the long voyage to Valhalla. And always the girl was there, waiting, drinking, singing, laughing at times, though perhaps from nerves more than joy. Everyone knew she would not leave this world alive. The Priestess of Death. When the day of the funeral finally came, the most feared figure of all appeared, the Angel of Death. This was not a mythological being, but a flesh and blood woman, a priestess. She was old, strong, and utterly ruthless. Covered in dark garments, she carried the tools of sacrifice: rope, dagger, and knowledge of the rites. She alone would lead the girl into death. The Angel of Death took the girl by the arm and began the final ritual. The girl was lifted high above a wooden frame, almost like a doorway between worlds. She was given a cup of strong alcohol to drink, then lowered down again. This was done 3 times. Each time symbolized her passage first into death, then into the spirit world, and finally into the presence of the gods. As the crowd gathered, the girl was led into the ship, where the dead man's body lay waiting. She was laid beside him, her head resting against his chest, her body adorned as if for marriage. But then came the final horrifying act: the killing. The Angel of Death produced a dagger. 2 men grabbed the girl by the throat, strangling her until she lost consciousness. Then, in one swift motion, the priestess stabbed her in the chest, piercing her heart. In that moment, her life ended. Her spirit, the Vikings believed, was now bound to her master. Together they would travel into the afterlife, he to Valhalla, she to serve him forever. The crowd did not turn away. They did not weep. They cheered. The sacrifice was not seen as cruelty. It was seen as sacred, necessary, a guarantee that the dead man would not enter the afterlife alone. Ibn Fadlan himself, horrified, wrote, "I saw with my own eyes this dreadful thing, and I never imagined that human beings could endure such a sight." For him, it was barbaric. For the Vikings, it was divine. The pyre of smoke and fire. Once the girl was dead, the funeral reached its climax. The ship was set ablaze. Flames devoured the timbers, the cushions, the weapons, the food, the animals, and the 2 human bodies at the center. Thick black smoke curled into the sky, a signal to the gods that a warrior had fallen. The people cheered and wailed, a mixture of grief and ecstasy. As the fire roared, the Angel of Death walked calmly away. Her task was finished. Another soul had been delivered into the hands of the gods. When the fire finally died, the remains were gathered. Ashes, bones, and charcoal were collected and buried beneath a mound of earth. From that day forward, the mound became a sacred site, a marker of the dead man's honor and power. The terror behind the ritual. It's easy to dismiss Ibn Fadlan's account as exaggerated, a foreigner shocked by what he saw, but archaeology has supported parts of his story. Graves across Scandinavia and beyond have been found with multiple human remains, sometimes women buried alongside men, with signs of violent death. In one grave, a young woman was buried with a broken collarbone, suggesting she had been struck down before burial. In others, the arrangement of bodies suggests deliberate sacrifice. The Vikings truly believed that human sacrifice gave strength to the dead. They believed the gods demanded blood, and in their world, where death was ever present, this belief shaped how funerals unfolded. Of course, not every Viking funeral was so gruesome. Sacrifices of animals were far more common than sacrifices of humans. But for the elite, the powerful, the warriors who wanted to show the gods their worth, nothing less than human blood would do. The lesson for the living. These sacrifices were not just about the dead, they were about the living. To the community watching, the message was clear. Life was fragile, death was near, and the gods demanded respect. To disobey tradition was to risk the wrath of Odin, Freya, and Hel herself. Funerals then were both terrifying and reassuring. They showed that the dead were honored, that their souls were guided, and that the community still stood strong in the face of chaos. But to outsiders like Ibn Fadlan, they revealed something darker. A society where death was not just inevitable, it was embraced. A society where terror and devotion walked hand in hand. Part 4. Burials versus burning. Two paths to the afterlife. The Vikings believed that death was not the end of the journey, it was the beginning of another voyage. But how that voyage began depended greatly on how a person's body was sent into the afterlife. And here lies one of the most haunting truths about Viking funerals. There was no single way to honor the dead. Some were buried beneath massive mounds of earth, their treasures locked away for eternity. Others were sent off in roaring flames, their very bodies turned into smoke that drifted toward the heavens. Both methods were terrifying in their own way. Both were designed to remind the living of what awaited them when their time came. The burial mounds, tombs of power and fear. When most people think of Viking burials, they imagine warriors placed in ships, set aflame, and pushed out to sea. But in reality, one of the most common forms of Viking funerals was burial beneath great mounds of earth. Across Scandinavia, these mounds still rise from the ground, green hills shaped by human hands, hiding graves beneath. To the Vikings, these were not just tombs, they were monuments of power. Inside, the dead were placed in wooden chambers, often resembling small houses. A warrior might be laid out with his sword across his chest, his shield beside him, and his helmet at his side. A woman might be buried with her jewelry, brooches, and keys, the symbols of her authority in the household. But these graves were not quiet. Archaeologists have uncovered chilling details inside Viking mounds. Multiple human bodies, often women or slaves, buried alongside the elite. Some show signs of violent death. Others appear to have been strangled or struck down. Just as with ship burials, sacrifice sometimes accompanied the interment. To the community, these mounds were reminders of power, but also of fear. They loomed over the land like watchful eyes, silent warnings that the dead were never truly gone. The ship burial, a vessel for eternity. Then there were the ship burials, the most spectacular and the most terrifying. A ship was the Vikings' ultimate symbol of freedom and strength. It was their weapon, their tool, their lifeline. And in death, it became their coffin. In some cases, the dead were placed inside an actual ship, hauled onto land, buried beneath a mound, and covered with earth. Other times, the ship itself was set ablaze, turning into a blazing beacon of fire and smoke. The message was clear. Death was a voyage, and the ship was the vessel that carried the soul across the unknown waters of the afterlife. Imagine standing on the shore as flames engulfed a funeral ship. The crackle of burning wood filled the air. The smell of charred flesh, animals, and offerings clung to the wind. Sparks flew into the night sky like spirits fleeing into the heavens. For the living, it was awe-inspiring, but it was also deeply unsettling, because in that moment, death was not hidden, it was displayed for all to see. The horror of the cremation pyres. Cremation was not unique to Vikings. Many ancient cultures burned their dead, but the Vikings turned the act into a terrifying spectacle. The pyre was not just about disposal, it was about transformation. Fire consumed the body, reduced it to ash, and carried its essence upward in thick black smoke. The Vikings believed the smoke itself was a message to the gods, signaling that a warrior or leader had arrived. But for those standing close, the experience was harrowing. Imagine hearing the bones crack and pop inside the flames, seeing bodies shift and curl as the fire devoured them. In the heat of the pyre, human flesh blistered and split, spilling fluids into the fire. The sound alone would haunt anyone who witnessed it. And yet, for the Vikings, this was not horror. It was holy. The closer the flames reached toward the sky, the more certain the people felt that their loved one's soul had reached Valhalla, or whichever afterlife awaited them. Who got buried and who got burned? Not every Viking funeral followed the same path. Cremation and burial were often tied to status, wealth, and tradition. For powerful leaders, the ship burial was the highest honor, a costly display that showed the world their greatness even in death. For others, simple cremations on open pyres sufficed, with ashes buried in urns beneath small mounds. Sometimes families even combined both methods, burning the body first, then burying the ashes with grave goods. In some regions, burials dominated. In others, cremation was the norm. But always there was a sense of dread and awe. Whether a body was swallowed by earth or fire, the funeral was not just a farewell. It was a terrifying reminder that the gods were watching, that the dead were restless, and that one day, everyone standing there would join them. The superstition of restless dead. Another reason Viking funerals were so elaborate was fear that the dead might not stay buried. In Norse belief, the draugr, a restless, undead spirit, was always a threat. If a funeral was not performed correctly, the dead could rise again. They would crawl from their mounds, dragging their decayed bodies into the night, seeking vengeance on the living. To prevent this, Vikings took terrifying precautions. Some bodies were pinned down with heavy stones or spears. Others were decapitated, their heads placed at their feet to stop them from walking again. Even burning the body to ash was seen as a way to make sure no ghost could return. This fear of the dead added another layer of horror to Viking funerals. The living weren't just mourning, they were protecting themselves from their own loved ones. The community's role, terror, and unity. Whether it was burial or cremation, Viking funerals were community events. People gathered from far and wide. They feasted, drank, and sang. But the joy was laced with dread. The funeral was a reminder that death was close, that the gods were merciless, and that their own fates might be just as grim. For children, it was their first glimpse into mortality, watching the flames devour flesh, or seeing a body lowered into the earth. For warriors, it was a rehearsal of their own destiny. For leaders, it was proof that even power and wealth could not defy death. Every mound raised, every ship burned, every body sacrificed was both a tribute and a warning. Which was more terrifying? So which was more terrifying, burial or burning? Burials held their own kind of horror. The thought of being buried alive in a cold, dark chamber surrounded by silence and earth was enough to chill anyone. Add to that the possibility of sharing your grave with sacrificed slaves or animals, and the mound became less a tomb and more a prison. Burnings, on the other hand, were loud, violent, and public. They exposed death in its rawest form. Nothing was hidden. Everyone saw the body twist in the fire, everyone smelled the flesh, everyone knew exactly what awaited them when their time came. In truth, both paths were terrifying, and that was the point. For the Vikings, funerals were not meant to comfort the living. They were meant to confront them with the reality of mortality, to terrify them into respecting the gods, honoring the dead, and preparing themselves for their own inevitable journey. Part 5. The final terror of a Viking funeral. The Viking funeral was never just about death. It was about fear, about spectacle, and about reminding every living soul who witnessed it that the grave or the pyre was waiting for them too. For the people of the Viking Age, death was not hidden away in hospitals or softened by ceremony. It was loud, violent, bloody, and unforgettable. And if you stood among them, if you had smelled the smoke of burning flesh, or watched a slave dragged screaming toward the knife, or felt the earth tremble as a mound was raised, you would have understood. Viking funerals were not designed to comfort the grieving. They were designed to terrify the living. The funeral as a performance of power. Every Viking funeral was theater. The body, the weapons, the animals, the sacrifices, the pyre or mound, all of it was staged. The living acted as audience, bearing witness to a story of death that reinforced the power of gods, kings, and warriors. When a great chieftain died, his funeral was as much about proving his dominance in death as it had been in life. His ship became a burning monument, his mound a mountain of memory. Even his slaves, forced to die with him, became unwilling actors in the play. But here's the most chilling part. These funerals were not only about honoring the dead, they were also about controlling the living, by showing that death was terrifying by making people watch the fire consume flesh or hear the cries of sacrifice. The Viking elite ensured loyalty, obedience, and fear. If this was how they treated their honored dead, how much worse might it be for their enemies? The gods were always watching. The Norse gods thrived on terror. Odin demanded warriors slain and sent to Valhalla. Freya claimed her share in Folkvangr. The sea goddess Ran was believed to drag the drowned to her hall beneath the waves. Even Hel, ruling over the dishonored dead, was a figure of dread, half woman, half rotting corpse. Funerals were offerings to these gods. The smoke, the sacrifices, the blood, every detail was designed to appease them. For the Vikings, the thought of angering the gods was worse than death itself. If a funeral was botched, if the right offerings were not made, the soul of the dead might wander restlessly, never finding peace. And worse still, the gods might curse the entire community. This fear turned funerals into spectacles of divine devotion. The living weren't just mourning, they were bargaining, ensuring that the gods would favor the dead and protect the survivors. The dead were never truly gone. One of the most terrifying beliefs in Viking culture was that the dead could return. The draugr, the restless undead, haunted Norse folklore. These were not ghosts in white sheets. They were bloated, blackened corpses that crawled from their graves to attack the living. They could grow in size, wield weapons, and crush men with superhuman strength. And the only way to prevent such horrors was to bury or burn the dead properly. That is why graves were sealed with stones, why some corpses were pinned with spears, why heads were sometimes removed and placed between legs. It was not just superstition, it was protection. The funeral was as much about containing the dead as it was about honoring them. This fear gave every Viking funeral an added layer of horror. Because as the mound was sealed, or as the flames roared higher, there was always a whisper in the crowd. What if it wasn't enough? What if he comes back? The children who watched. We often forget one chilling detail. Viking children were present at funerals. They grew up watching death in its rawest form. They saw slaves sacrificed, animals slaughtered, ships burned, and bodies buried with weapons. They smelled the rot, the smoke, the blood. Imagine being a child, watching a screaming woman strangled beside your father's chieftain. Imagine hearing the bones pop in the fire. Imagine being told, "This is what will happen to you someday." Death was not hidden from them. It was carved into their minds from the very beginning. Perhaps this explains why Viking warriors became so fearless in battle. They were not strangers to death. They had seen it, smelled it, touched it since childhood. By the time they held a sword, the terror had already been burned into their souls. The horrors that lingered after the funeral. Even when the flames died out and the mound was sealed, the funeral did not end. The living carried the memories with them. The slaves' screams, the smell of charred flesh, the sight of blood soaking the ground. These images haunted them long after the rituals were done. In fact, that was the point. The funeral was supposed to scar the memory. It was supposed to remind everyone who saw it that death was not peaceful, it was violent, chaotic, terrifying. This way, every feast, every raid, every prayer carried the shadow of the funeral. The Vikings lived with death always at their side because they had witnessed it so closely. The legacy of terror. When we look back on Viking funerals today, we often romanticize them. We picture the lone ship drifting across a still sea, its flames reflected in the water, a majestic farewell for a noble warrior. But the truth was far darker. The ship wasn't always a romantic drift into the horizon. Sometimes it was hauled ashore and set ablaze, its flames blinding and brutal. The mound wasn't always a quiet resting place, it was a prison for the restless dead. And the sacrifices weren't symbolic, they were real. Human lives were taken, blood was spilled, and terror was spread among the living. That is the legacy of Viking funerals. They were not gentle send-offs, they were brutal, unforgettable displays meant to scar the mind, appease the gods, and remind everyone that death was not an escape. It was a confrontation with the unknown, a final vision. So imagine for one last time that you are there. The air is thick with smoke. A ship burns before you, the flames reaching so high they seem to lick the stars. The screams of the dying slaves, animals, perhaps even friends echo in your ears. The body of your leader twists in the fire, his sword glowing red before shattering in the heat. The crowd around you is silent, their faces lit by firelight, their eyes wide with fear. Children clutch their mothers. Warriors stand rigid, pretending not to tremble. You look at the flames and realize This is not just his journey. This is yours too. One day, you will be the body in the fire. One day, the gods will be watching you. The ship collapses inward, its burning timbers hissing as they fall into the black water. Sparks shoot into the night sky, vanishing into the darkness. And with them, the soul of the dead departs carried upward into eternity. The funeral is over, but the terror remains. Viking funerals were not noble, not peaceful, not serene. They were brutal, bloody, and terrifying. They were acts of power, fear, and devotion rituals that scarred the living as much as they honored the dead. If you lived in the Viking Age, you would not have been comforted by them. You would have been haunted by them. And that haunting truth is what makes Viking funerals unforgettable even today.